Hello, everyone. Welcome to the June 11th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the Interim Governance Facilitator. I am joined by Mr. LongForWisdom, who is the real Governance Facilitator as mandated by the community. Very exciting stuff. Hopefully I'll be foisting a significant amount of responsibilities. Sharing a significant amount of responsibilities with him in the coming weeks. Today's call is eclectic. We are going to hear from a series of mandated actors in the ecosystem, which is another really interesting and cool evolution of how we do things here. As specific groups of activities become identified, they need to be managed and people need to do work on them and they need to coordinate. And the way that that happens is a domain or a group of actors are assembled, come up with a really cool title for themselves, they come up with a mandate, and they are voted in by the ecosystem to assume specific responsibilities, as evidenced by my existence, the governance facilitator. Today we'll be hearing from the Oracle team, we'll be hearing from the MIPs editor, we'll be hearing from the smart contracts team, and we'll be hearing from risk. So lots and lots to go over. I am going to probably minimize my metaphysical ponderings for later, and we're going to jump right into things. Let's kick off with the governance section. I'm going to hand it off to LongForWisdom to give us governance at a glance, and then we'll move on. Long, you want to take it away?
Yep, can do. Cool. All right, so we've had a couple of discussion threads pop up this week for discussion, and there's a couple of other things to bring up that I'm going to mention. But we'll start with the active discussions. So we had a older thread kind of resurface, which was the one about why maker holders aren't voting, and we had a couple of new responses to that, which were quite useful in terms of people sharing like their thoughts, maker holders sharing their thoughts around voting, sharing the reasons why they tend either not to vote or to vote, and like the things that motivate them either way. So that was worth a mention because there's some interesting stuff in there. We had, I mentioned this is probably going to mention.
Actually, before you move on, Long, let me jump in there and make your life more difficult. What are the? Yes, that's my gig, and it's also my pleasure. What are some of the most common complaints or friction points for people voting?
So the initial post in that thread is essentially a summary of everything we came up with. For the new stuff, there was, let's see, that's a really good one. Yeah, so forum user called Elliot's shared some core reasons as to generally kind of why he votes. He mentioned, I was mentioning his stuff because this was probably the most interesting. He mentioned that the main reason he votes is because he likes MakerDAO and wants to support it. And based on his numbering system, that took precedence over the fact that like he owns Maker and wants it to gain in value, which I think is interesting because kind of shows that for at least some people, this is not like, obviously probably quite a lot of people like voting because they want to see the protocol succeed, like in a more general sense, rather than specifically in a selfish sense to make money, which is cool. Yeah, and then he listed a couple of reasons that he tends not to vote. Yeah, so it's kind of the general stuff about like outcomes generally being determined by larger holders. Votes being difficult to understand if you're not sort of like looped in, and being worried that voting without having an understanding of the issues will hurt rather than help. The like direct benefits of voting are fairly small, outweighed by fees, and the time it takes to research. 4, it's easy to forget. And 5, that it's kind of difficult to consider long-term and make kind of rational judgments as to like long-term indirect benefits, which again I thought were all interesting points.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I wonder if people aren't just being a little overly fancy. I think that one of the major friction points is just a huge pain in the ass, and it's boring.
Yeah, that's yeah, that was on a number of people's lists over the last. I mean, this thread's been here for like ages.
Yeah, if I had to make a list, it'd be boring, pain in the ass, and also just a fundamental tragedy of the commons, right? Like what's the point of picking up litter if nobody else is picking up litter and then nobody picks up litter? So like, what's the point of voting if nobody else is voting? We just sit around and wait for the rich people to do it.
Yeah,
it's a tough one. So if anybody has any solutions about how we can combat a fundamental logical fallacy embedded in human nature since the dawn of time, please let us know. It seems like the running solutions seem to be delegation, which is, well, I shouldn't, well, maybe I will. Yeah, I'm feeling feisty. Delegation feels, there's a complaint that, well, let's just wait for the whales to do it, because what's the point of me voting? I'm only a krill. But if all the krills got together, we would absolutely destroy the whale. So that's not really a valid argument. But then let's just do delegation, so I can just simply give my vote directly to the whales. I'm not sure how that's a solution, but there we go. The other one is pay people to vote. And as far as I'm aware, it's never been pulled off successfully. Interesting problems. Yeah, who knows? Let's come up with a magical algorithm that will incentivize. Maybe a bonding curve will fix it. Anyway. Oh man, I'm in one of those moods today. All right, what else is on the schedule?
cool. Yeah, I'll carry on. Yeah, so that was one of the things I was to mention. Something else that may or may not get mentioned later is that Charles posted a thread talking about a potential redesign of the liquidation system, which has kind of gathered a lot of discussion. I'd encourage everyone who was kind of around during Black Thursday, and just everyone generally, to take a look at that. I was thoroughly enjoyed reading it. Then we had a thread on increasing the WBTC debt ceiling, created by Hongbiao Li, probably butchering the name, sort of suggesting that we should increase it, and so there's some discussion in that thread, kind of for and against. Anecdotally, there's been at least one person I've seen in Maker Chat who was trying to mint DAI off of BTC but wasn't able to because of the debt ceiling. So I think there's definitely more demand there. Obviously, whether that means you should up it or not is another thing. But cool. So that's the actual discussions. Another thing that's probably going to get just discussed in more detail later. But Nick created a signal request asking about whether we could temporarily process the Oracle proposals through the weekly governance cycle. I won't go into that too much yet. I'll let Nick talk about it later. Then the other couple of things I wanted to mention were kind of on some ongoing initiatives. Specifically, SourceCred is now kind of in progress. There are going to be weekly posts that kind of discuss or kind of give the list of credit scores and the DAI earned for those people. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. One thing to note is that if you do want to receive DAI for forum contributions, you do need to opt in. There are instructions of how to do that in the SourceCred posts, but it isn't like automatic, so you do need to go to someone and tell them an address to send you stuff.
Yeah, so for the people that are just, or maybe haven't been paying that close attention or joining for the first time, let me TLDR that. SourceCred is running an experiment in the forums. If you engage with the forums and you do things that are useful according to the algorithm and the community, you get money in the form of DAI. So if you're interested, look for that forum post and read through it and sign up and contribute. Back to you all.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. So, all correct. Then the other thing I wanted to mention, which is something that's kind of been continuing on the download for a little while, is that the vol compensation. There is a working group working on vol compensation. Progress is kind of going, but they're getting a little bit bogged down. One of the things that MakerMan thinks would be useful is if they can get someone to essentially look at all the work that MakerMan specifically has done regarding analysis of the vault compensation and the liquidations, etc. To just kind of look through what he's done and make sure that he hasn't made any obvious mistakes, just sort of check over his work. So if anyone feels like they would be up for doing that, get in touch.
Yeah, I might want to, yeah, I'm just going to keep on jumping in randomly. Here's the chorus again. So there's obviously a long history, a complex situation around the vault compensation strategies. There's also a class action lawsuit outstanding. So what I can say about this situation is fantastically limited. But what I will say is this, is that this is a community-led effort. The community is organized, community has identified an issue that they would like to address, and the community is working together to come up with some solutions about how to address those. There's challenges associated with that because the community needs to self-organize and then plug itself into the hooks that have been exposed by the protocol and some of the cultural norms and all kinds of other crazy things like that. But primarily, it's probably the first exercise where the community has gone together in order to create a project. And that's project in the sense that I think that most of us are familiar with, because we all presumably have other meetings than this one during the course of the week. So establishing scope, requirements, documenting that, finding stakeholders, coming up with a project plan, getting people to do work, figuring out how to compensate them, project stuff. From my outside looking in perspective, the compensation group has been having some challenges around the establishment of that project aspect. And I think that they're having some resourcing issues. And so this is obviously an issue that touches a lot of people in the ecosystem, or in this call potentially, and in the community in general. So if you have skills when it comes to project management or scoping or just doing businessy type work, and you have skin in this game, horse in this race, dog, whatever, consider reaching out to that group and offering your services. This is kind of like a tragedy of the commons thing, or maybe I might be overusing that. I need to like wiki up that definition again. But anyways, there's people that want something to be done, and we're running into, the community is running into a situation where there's a lot of people poking something with a stick, wondering why nobody else is doing something. And so if you have the capacity to help out, please consider joining the discussion with that group and seeing if you can help remove some of the friction. It's, yeah, I'm not going to dig into it too much more, but it needs to be an effective project for it to move forward. And right now, there's one or two people, from what I can see, shouldering a significant amount of the load, and it's causing some frictions with the ecosystem and the community and spec and perception and all the rest of it. So if you can help improve that process, please reach out to the group and see what you can do. All right. I said I wasn't going to do speechifying, but I just decided to break it up into 20 different parts. I apologize. Back to you, Long.
No, I'm pretty much done, I think. I just wanted to highlight those things. So yeah, move on.
Cool. Lots and lots of things happening in the forums. Please join us and get stuck in. All right, Nick, I'm going to hand it off to you to talk about the weekly cycle.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Rich. Yeah, so this will be pretty quick. So what's happened is that we've built up quite a backlog of Oracle proposals. So that would be MIP 10. And as we've been looking through what the contents of MIP 10 are, and this is slightly my fault because I designed MIP 10 kind of independently from the rest of the MIPs. It came to light that the MIP 10 is really not conforming to the monthly governance cycle that all of the other MIPs use. So while we are going to refactor MIP 10 to be a more standard MIP and behave like other MIPs behave, we do have to do something in the interim for all the proposals that we've built up in our backlog, right? So we have a bunch of whitelisting proposals from DeFi Saver, and these are really important because excuse me, their automation service, which basically will save CDPs before they get liquidated, right? It's dependent on having access to our oracles to do this in a trustless manner, right? So if we think about like a kind of a Black Thursday type of scenario, you know, we really want to support services like automation. So it's important that we pass these types of proposals sooner rather than later. The other thing is that there is another team that's trying to get access to the TUSD Oracle, and they're trying to launch soon, and their launch actually depends on being able to access the Oracle. And then there's quite a few light feed proposals. So currently we have like Kyber, Infura, and Etherscan, and I believe Gitcoin is about to post one as well. So adding new light feeds would, you know, just continue to increase the security of the oracles, which I think is something really important, especially as the system scales, right? So currently, right, we have DYDX, we have 0x, we have SEP protocol, we have Gnosis, and we have the Maker Foundation running a light feed. But I think we should be kind of prioritizing adding new projects, like really kind of credible partners in the space. One, because it'll generate more of kind of a community around the Maker protocol. And the other, because it's kind of a protocol for the community by the community, right? So instead of referencing some, you know, hedge funds or professional price services or whatever, you know, if you see an Etherscan, if you see a Gitcoin, if you see an Infura or a Kyber, right, users are gonna trust your protocol more. So the sooner that we can get these types of proposals into the system, you know, whether they pass or not is fine, but the sooner that we can process these, the better. So in the past, we've usually done this through the weekly governance cycle, and if you look in the forum thread, I posted, I think there's like a dozen references to how we've done this in the past. So I'm proposing that in this kind of interim period before we've refactored MIP 10, that we just kind of go through the Oracle proposal backlog through the weekly cycle. And that is it for me, Rich. Thanks.
All right, cool. That's going to be, yeah, so we are transitioning from, well, we're evolving over time from the processes that sort of arose organically to how to do governance and moving into the MIPS process. And it's going to be phased approach, I think. So over the course of the next month or two, I'm sure we'll be firmly embedded in the new MIPS world, but we also have to balance process with the expediencies of running a business and supporting a protocol. So this is probably an example of one of those reasons, or one of those situations where we just need to do what works today and then aim towards what's going to work more effectively in the future. So thanks for that recap, Nick. Yeah, the smart contracts.
Rich, if you don't mind, just like one very brief comment on that. To further, you know, I think that's like this Oracle proposal really like highlights the tension between precedence and flexibility. Like Nick is absolutely 100% right that a lot of these Oracle applications are like really good ones. It would be amazing to see them included in the protocol. Personally, I'm very much in favor of doing it in the governance weekly cycles as he's put forward. But it's just a question for like this governance call as to which we prefer, precedence or flexibility. You know, a large part of what Charles put together in that MIP process is about providing flexibility. So I think it's great that we lean toward that. But I think that that's, you know, it needs to be clear that this is the trade-off being made here. And also, on another personal note, like Nick, it's so great to see you wearing that hat again, man. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's part of the decision-making process, right? We need to kind of dig into risk versus reward and prioritize. And collateral onboarding is obviously a huge priority for the protocol right now. The problem is that it's very complicated, and so yeah, I actually, yeah, I agree with you completely, Crypto, Andy. But I think that as long as you keep a very clear eye on where you hope to be, and you ensure that week to week you are closer to that goal, that's generally fine with me, as opposed to sort of tearing off the Band-Aid and doing everything immediately and hoping that the fallout was worth it. So I don't know. There's different philosophies, right? So there's iteration, there's strict adherence to process, there's evaluating business needs as opposed to social and protocol needs. It's enormously complicated. I'm not going to be able to unpack it completely, but I can assure everyone that I'm really enjoying watching it happen. It's a team effort, so we'll all have to work together to figure out what the solutions are here. Charles, off to you. Speaking of MIPS, here's Charles to talk about MIPS.
Sweet. Yeah. So this week's activity, the inclusion polls did go out on Monday. There were 7 of them, and they ended just 25 minutes ago. So today, Long and Rich are going to perform the inclusion poll review for those 7 polls and confirm the results of which proposals can then move on to the governance polls next Monday. So after this, Long and Rich will do that inclusion review of those polls. Next week's activity, those governance polls will be submitted for the proposals that have indeed passed the inclusion poll stage. These polls will run for 3 days, ending on Thursday. And just to recap, the purpose of these polls is to determine if the proposals at hand should proceed to the final executive vote in week 4. And on that next Thursday during this call, the governance facilitators will confirm the governance poll results and dictate which of the proposals will move on to that final executive vote. In other news, in terms of collateral onboarding, Mariano is going to speak toward the TUSD token upgrades, I think, after me. Next Monday, there's also going to be 2 governance polls for KNC and ZRX that will go out on Monday as part of the weekly cycle to determine if they will proceed to that executive vote on the Friday. The community greenlight polls have concluded, and the collateral status index has been updated by LongForWisdom. The next community greenlight polls will go on June 22nd in the final week of June's governance cycle. I do want to note that if the amendment MIPs pass at the end of this month, the community greenlight polls in the future will begin on the 3rd Monday of the month, running for 2 weeks and ending in the final week of that governance cycle instead of carrying over to the following month, which helps make the process more efficient. In terms of the forms for MIPS, there were 2 subcategories added. One is for proposal ideas, in which the redesign of the liquidation system pre-MIPS discussion was posted just yesterday. The general idea here is that if anyone in the community has an idea for a future improvement proposal, they can go in and post their thoughts and their ideas behind it and start discussing with other community members to get feedback and eventually turn it into a formal maker improvement proposal. The other category is polls and votes. So this is a read-only category that will be dedicated to providing more awareness and notification of what is going on during the governance cycle in terms of voting. It will also be that go-to place to see what the active inclusion polls are, governance polls, execs, all related to MIPS. So that also kind of addresses Andy's comment in the chat further about having a notification type system, or at least more places to see what the active votes are instead of a couple days before the end of the votes and that kind of thing. So this category was just created and it is bare at the moment, but I will be updating it for the governance polls next Monday. So that concludes the weekly MIPS update for this week. It was a little shorter than last, and I think that Long is now going to do the inclusion poll review.
Yes, with the help of Rich Brown, the other governance facilitator.
Yes.
No, it's fine. Cool. So, as Charles said, there were, I believe, 7 MIPs which are up for votes this week, or had their inclusion polls this week. Or sorry, 7 MIPs / sub-proposals. So we had 4 amendment sub-proposals created by Charles to amend various parts of the collateral onboarding MIPs. We had a sub-proposal to include Cyrus as a risk domain team. And we had 2 MIPs that I created, one called Declarations of Intent, MIP 13, and one called Protocol Die Transfer, MIP 14. So the inclusion polls are finished. 6 of the 7 MIPs passed their inclusion poll, 6 of the 7 proposed things passed their inclusion poll. So that includes all of Charles's amendments to the collateral onboarding MIPs. It includes Cyrus's sub-proposal to onboard as a risk domain team. And it includes the Declarations of Intent MIP, MIP 13. The one MIP that did not succeed the inclusion poll is MIP 14, which was the protocol die transfer MIP that would have allowed governance to set a target for to receive die, which was drawn from the protocol. Yeah, so Rich, do you want to make any comments, I guess?
You know me all too well. I do want to make a comment. Well, a comment and a question, because this ties back to many, many, many different themes and themes that were talked about at the top of the call, and some very, very tasty meta-philosophical questions. So let's not use the compensation team as an example. Let's just use any team in the community that wants to do something. Depending on your philosophical and or political leanings, autonomy, in my opinion, and true agency is pretty hard to achieve if you can't fund your own activities, or you're expected to fund them out of pocket. So we have this situation where we're counting on the community to self-organize and establish identities and organizations and to do work for the protocol, so the protocol can be rapidly and aggressively decentralized, and the foundation can hand the protocol off to the ecosystem, and we can see what the world looks like at that point. The problem is that people need to be compensated for their work, and so we don't have a mechanism to do that right now. Long's poor beleaguered
and we still don't.
MIP would have solved that problem. So there's obviously pros and cons. So I'm not throwing shade here. It's a tremendously scary MIP in some ways, but it's a MIP that's required. It's not a. Let's detach it from the MIP. That MIP specifically. There needs to be a mechanism with which value can be taken out of the protocol and given to actors in the ecosystem that are going to support and improve the protocol. Because until that happens, it's going to be pretty hard to attract actors in the ecosystem that want to improve the protocol. Because let's face it, we all got to eat. So it's worth considering how are we going to bite off this problem. We need to do this sooner or later as a group. I keep on saying we, and it's hard for people to tell whether I'm talking about we foundation or we the community. And sometimes it's hard for me to tell sometimes. We the community need to be able to have agency, and part of that, one of the major components there is being able to pay people to do things for themselves. So what I would like to do is encourage the community and the ecosystem and this group to have another look at that MIP, try to figure out what it was that was alarming or unpalatable or what could be changed about it, and then consider what it would look like in its newest form. And I guess that's where my question comes in, and for Long and for Charles, I suppose, as you guys are most deeply familiar with the MIPS process. What happens now? Like, what is the idea for this? Like, does it have to go into the icebox, or can it just immediately go back into rotation with some tweaks, or what's the next step?
So in terms of what's written in the MIPS, this proposal was done through a MIP 2, which is a faster process and lasts for 3 months after the official ratification of the initial MIPs. So in order for this proposal, it can indeed be reintroduced for another vote. However, it does say that in order for it to proceed for another vote, it has to address the issues that resulted in its initial rejection. So just to further your point earlier, if people have reasoning behind why they didn't want to vote on it or why they voted no, please provide that in the MIP 14 forum post. And so we can figure out what the issues were so that we can in turn resolve these issues and then repropose it in an edited form or as is.
Yeah, that raises another interesting situation that we've run up against a few different times in the distant and more recent past, I suppose, that if the general consensus, I don't know, maybe that's a bold statement. I have deep reservations about using the word consensus, but if a poll goes up and that poll doesn't pass, occasionally it's because, obviously the ecosystem didn't want it, but every once in a while there's an interesting situation where one or more people begin to wonder, is it because the ecosystem didn't get it, or because it wasn't phrased correctly, or it just wasn't a bad time, or wasn't a good time? Then what's the solution? Is it because there's this assumption that the ecosystem got it wrong and we just need to ask them again? And that's just a huge question mark. So unless people do, as Charles pointed out, come into that thread and point out exactly why that was contentious, it's hard to get past it and work through the issues. So.
Isn't protocol funding like one of the major themes of future decentralized risk teams and all sorts of domain teams? Is there like a competing proposal, or is there like some separate track that we were on, then this one, didn't quite hit the right buckets or something?
Yeah, I think that there's a series of conversations and ideas around this stuff, and maybe Charles can talk specifically if there's something in the MIPS that address it. But we've talked about EPCs, we've talked about domain teams, we've talked about protocol funding, we've talked about the suck function and the buffer. This is one of the biggest rocks we have left to turn over. And you're right, Cyrus, like it's pretty hard to move forward with any of the existing domain teams that we've identified and decentralize those. It's hard to come up with new ones. It's hard to attract additional talent into the ecosystem unless there's a clear path for people to get compensated for their work. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's something that needs to be addressed fairly rapidly, though.
Just, I was thinking, like, for the vault compensation, like this could have been a pretty juicy trial run with paying some specialized blockchain analysis company to pour through the data and kind of confirm the work of the working group.
There
Yeah,
are
I
a
think
number.
that, well,
No,
go ahead, Long. I talked too much. Go ahead.
There are a number of things that it would have been useful to have this or something like this to do in terms of the vault compensation stuff. Like, so as you said, like paying someone to audit, but also actually paying like the working group members themselves, because there's a number of people essentially working in this working group on this thing for like, and it doesn't really benefit them directly, other than just them owning Maker, and like all of them have like other stuff going on, right? Like they all have their own lives and things. So, and it's kind of difficult to convince people to kind of work under those conditions without remuneration, basically. Especially when it's something that we want to happen like quickly, because it's like sure, if we were happy with it happening like in like 6 months to a year, then I'd say yeah, just like let people volunteer, it'll happen eventually, right? But this is one of those situations where we kind of want something done sooner rather than later, I think.
Yeah, there's nothing better to solve the problem of commitment drop off than money, paying people for their time, right? And there's a lot of smaller initiatives that this type of mechanism could be beta tested on. So I think that the key here is that people boost into that MIP and make their concerns known or ask some piercing questions. And my suggestion would be, or not suggestion, my guess. This basically what you're doing is we have like basically a bucket of money with a protocol attached to it, and there's no valve on that bucket. So it can be alarming. Well, let's just take a hammer and smash a valve into the side of it and see what happens. That could make it difficult for some people to sleep at night, considering how poorly that could turn out. So there needs to be checks and balances and thresholds and circuit breakers and kill switches and whatever other euphemism you want. I think that it's just a matter of figuring out what's the sandbox that this kind of valve could live in before we move forward with this stuff. So we need some creative thinking there.
So just, yeah, I mean, like I'm completely with Sice and Long that there are many, many different use cases for this stuff. I wonder, you know, just from the history and from that forum post as it stands at the moment in terms of possible issues that people had with it. You know, I know Lev brought up this fact that we might have wanted to limit it to make sure that you couldn't withdraw more from the surplus that would, you know, initiate flop auctions. I know that Long was somewhat against that but perhaps it's worth reconsidering that given the results of this inclusion poll. And the other thing is perhaps we need to think about more carefully delineating the conditions around what kind of accounts or how the account that receives the DAI can spend it. That would perhaps give people a little bit more security. Those are the two things from the history that I can remember of.
The one thing that sort of gave me pause was the pick an account where the money shows up part. That made me slightly nervous. I think that in the future, if I had to guess what these kinds of things are going to look like, is that one of these ratified domain teams that we're going to have in the future that we haven't quite defined yet is going to be accounting, the distributed accounting team of the crypto maker ecosystem or whatever. So like a group of people that can get together and can say, okay, well, we're in charge of the budget that comes out of the SUC, and that we can handle allocations and disbursements and reviews and audits. And like we need decentralized accountants, and like this is one of the less sexy things that we need to accept, I think, as we decentralize, is that not everything is the rock and roll world of risk and smart contract development. There's things that are less exciting that need to be bitten off. We need decentralized lawyers. We need decentralized accountants. We need decentralized finance people. We need decentralized auditors. And I think that maybe a team that's in charge of the DAO's budget would be able to handle some of these things, because otherwise well, I don't know, maybe this is just my own personal biases, but we're if you boil it down, it's the question, do we want to come up with the perfect algorithm and hope that somebody doesn't end up spending $2.6 million in fees, or do we want to have a group of people who are mandated with making decisions about where funds come out of the buffer and who they go to, and how they can guarantee that, or make some assumptions to the rest of the ecosystem that those funds were well spent and value for money was achieved. But yeah, so this is a large issue, and we're running out of time, so we have some weighty things that need to be addressed today. So perhaps we could push this off into the Q&A session.
Yeah, potentially come back to it. I think sounds good.
All right. Was there anything else from you, Long? From MIPS, or can we hand it off to Mariano? At the bit.
I guess I'll just quickly say, so to echo kind of what Charles said, what this means is that next week there will be a single poll go up, which asks whether all 6 of these approved proposals should go forward to an executive. So in this sense, there's like one poll in which they're all bundled, which is kind of intended as kind of like a trial run for the executive. So the idea being that if this bundle at this stage passes, you know, with a large majority, then it's safe. It's easier to expect the executive to pass with a large majority as well. Because having weak executives lying around is potentially dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's me. Can move on to Mariano.
All right, thank you, LongForWisdom. Mariano, what's been going on in your
Cool.
world? Anything interesting?
Thank you. Yeah, something interesting happened last week, and I want to thank the TrueUSD team. I think we have Hal and Ryan here. Hope they're still around, and they can talk a little bit to the community. But let me first say what happened on the smart contract side. So as you know, and I'm going to make this quick, as you know, multi-collateral DAI works with what we call adapters. So any new token or collateral that we use has to have its own adapter, so it can then interact with the system. Now, in the case of standard or compliant ERC20s, as we call them, we can reuse adapters, but for certain collaterals, we need to tweak them a little bit. And you know, this is the case for tokens with different decimals than, you know, the somewhat standard 18 or with other considerations. In the case of TrueUSD, the token uses what we call an upgradable proxy pattern. So the actual address, the base address doesn't change, but it gives teams or, you know, authorized actors the ability to upgrade these tokens. And while this is great, in some cases, you know, to fix bugs or to add functionality, in the case of multi-collateral DAIs, you know, adapters are probably one of the most powerful contracts in the whole system. The smart contracts team decided that for TrueUSD, we were going to test something that we call pinning and allowing certain implementations. So last week, when the code was voted in, there was an implementation that was added to the allow list, and that's the one you know, that MCD voted in, and that's the code that the smart contracts team looked at and vetted and decided that everything was proper. But yeah, and Brian posting you know, the link to the code. But then just as the spell was being executed, there were a couple of upgrades to the TrueUSD token, and this meant that you know, there was a new implementation, and the system instantly, you know, when you try to join or exit the system with TrueUSD, it would detect that the implementation was different and would not let you, you know, join or exit the system. Once this happens, you can still draw DAI with any token that was already there, and you can pay up your debt. But for example, you cannot add more to it than what's already in there. And I think it's a good thing that this happened now, you know, with a token that there was only one vault open, and that was from somebody from the foundation. We were doing testing on mainnet, you know, for the UIs and everything. But this also opens up, you know, further considerations for other collaterals that may have this upgrade pattern and what to do about this. And also the fact that we should have better communication, you know, with the teams. And this is something that, you know, we started doing after the fact. But I mean, you know, these are all growing pains that we're going to face more and more. And we have the opportunity to either create new MIPs or come up with, you know, processes from the smart contracts domain team, the community, everybody. So I'll just be quick. Right now, TUSD is not currently usable in MCD. In order for it to become usable, the community would need to vote in the new implementation, the current one. And we would also, like the smart contracts team, we would probably have to look at what the current implementation looks like and just like give the okay. But I think now I'd like to turn it over to you know, the True Token team to maybe talk to the community a little bit, or I don't know, Long, if you want to like briefly say what the community posted in the forum, or I mean, whatever.
I can have a look quickly and find out what the community posted in the forum.
Yeah, I can jump here and just give a quick introduction.
Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
Hal. I'm a smart contract developer for TrueUSD. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to just talk briefly about the upgrades and sort of what upgrades might look like in the future. And I think this conversation is beneficial to sort of help Maker create a formal process for upgrades with future collateral tokens. I'm personally a big fan of Maker. I've been using Maker for about 1.5 years, so I'm happy to sort of be a part of the community and help with these sorts of things. Yeah, my proposal specifically for TrueUSD, and maybe this can sort of become a model for future token upgrades for collateral, is basically before any upgrade is made, we publicly announce the upgrade and deploy the new implementation like as far ahead of time before the upgrade as possible. So I was thinking about maybe 2 weeks. If every, like you said, every implementation needs to be voted in on, then potentially more time. That's sort of something I'm not completely familiar with, but yeah, and we would basically create a public post, potentially in the forum and on maybe in other places for TrueUSD, with links to the old and new implementations, along with any notes and audits regarding the upgrade. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think that I think as the question sort of comes down to like what the voting process will look like for voting on new implementations and how long you think that will take.
Well, I think that there's other things that could be unpacked too. So there's the voting of new implementations and adapters and the auditing that goes along with it, and the technical considerations are mildly onerous, I imagine. But there's a larger question about what this implies for the ecosystem, because you talk about this a lot in these calls, but we're kind of cresting the wave on what it is we're all doing in this space. So we have this first mover disadvantage. And I think that we've run into a situation where we're beginning to understand that it's money Legos is a fun analogy, but it's kind of like money libs at this point. And if somebody updates a library and doesn't notify upstream about that library as a breaking change, then our money Legos turn into money Jengas. And so I wonder what that implies for the additional collateral types, for the wider ecosystem. Is there need to be some kind of a social layer imposed on top of this stuff? Like if Maker wants to upgrade a library, do we need to get into a call with 5 other DeFi organizations to clear that and make sure everybody understands, and vice versa, right? As we become more tightly coupled in this ecosystem, having people just change things could be fairly disastrous, considering there's money or value in motion here. Mariano, what's the solution to this problem?
And let me say that, for example, the solution that we put in, with the pinning implementations and allowing them specifically. So this doesn't also solve the problem completely. Like, a lot of stuff can happen in one block, and so this is just like one of the measures. And maybe even the community decides that, we're going against what an upgradable proxy pattern means, which is, make it transparent to the users that there are upgrades, and we just expect them to happen. And then maybe the risk is, passed only to the debt ceiling, maybe, the stability fee, or things like that. I think all of those are issues to be discussed.
It also, I think that let me clarify. So we live in an ecosystem that's vaguely antagonistic, and that's one of the strengths, right? Like the strongest and most adaptable protocol survive. There's no rules or councils that are determining who can release what when, and so that's interesting. I pitched to sort of a social layer where everybody agrees about whether if project A upgrades, then we have to notify C, D, and E to see whether they're impacted. But that's probably not realistic because you can't predict what the dependency chains are going to look like in this space. And so it feels like maybe the solutions need to be more defensive on the individual protocol level. Like you pick what it is you're going to support, and then you have circuit breakers, or you have like, all right, that ceiling goes to 0 because something weird happened. We don't understand what it means. Does that sound more along the lines of what you were discussing, Mariano?
Yeah, so for example, in our case, I'm going to be specific about this situation, in fact, and I'm going to leave it to, the community to decide further. So in this case, for example, the smart contracts domain team is already now, we have a avenue of communication with the trust token team, and they've already opened up a channel with the community in general. I would say that depending on how this goes, this may, influence writing of MIPs or standards for the future. I would say right now we have a token, a collateral that we cannot use. So maybe we can take this opportunity to, see how we fix this and then come up with a more formalized solution. I see a few avenues out of this. One is, having a poll on Monday, maybe requesting the smart contracts team to review the new code and get out a governance vote on either Friday or the following Friday, so 2 weeks from now. I encourage everybody to go to the forum post or, tag me or tag people from the smart contracts team and talk about this. But yeah, I'm not saying this is urgent right now, but it, would be good to discuss all of this ramifications because we are going to see it in the future with probably other types of collateral. And we caught this one, I would say, at the best possible time and with the least amount of disruption.
Yeah, and for that discussion, we're open if you have any questions about the smart contracts or any specific questions. I'm available. I believe we're in Telegram already, which is good. I also put the link to our general Telegram in the Zoom chat if anyone in the call is interested in learning about TrueUSD and sort of the nature of the changes that we're making. You can ask any questions there. And yeah, thanks for looping us into the discussion.
So another thing that kind of comes to mind of that TrueUSD is getting clarity from the TrueUSD folks about how and when the blacklist is used. Recently, we've had a proposal by Paxos for their stablecoin. They provided clarity on like exactly how that mechanism will be used. And that's also kind of just a huge part of auctions and being able to kind of, process the collateral through governance, like just having visibility and understanding of, how things work legally, right? So that would be, I guess, another thing to really consider. And I think just governance generally should, Mariano, you mentioned, things to like consider as we onboard like other types of centralized collateral. I think like this is like a really kind of important consideration to keep in mind when doing that.
Yeah, I can answer. The blacklist question is pretty straightforward. So TrueUSD is a compliant stablecoin, which means that we basically take care of all of the fiat on and off ramping. So the purpose of the blacklist is to prevent malicious parties who are engaging in money laundering or breaking the banking security.
Yeah, sure. No, sorry. Yeah, like I understand that. I guess what I'm saying is like
Yeah.
the actual implementation of the blacklist and like having that somewhere in writing. Or
I can take this. I can take this one out. I did not see the thread that Paxos shared, but I'd be curious if it's different than the terms of service that we've shared in the past. I think we posted that in our original post for addition to MakerDAO, and I think I followed up with it on a question on our second post. I guess it would just be helpful to kind of understand what level of clarity you guys are looking for.
I think our biggest fear would be that the collateral adapter gets blacklisted. That would be disastrous for the protocol.
Yeah, we would never do that.
Yeah, I can't think of any legitimate reason why we would ever do that. I mean, I can kind of give you a more formal answer if I speak to our legal team, but yeah, I think there's no circumstances under which we would do that.
Cool. Yeah, I can. I guess I'll. That's all very helpful, and thanks for providing that color on the call. And I can link to you. I'll put it in the chat as soon as I find it. The fact that like the FAQ that Pax put together, which I think is like really helpful and provided just a lot of provide a better understanding of how they're thinking about it, and it's really reassuring to hear you guys say that you would never blacklist the adapter, but you know, this is just things that like we're super concerned about because you know, like someone just mentioned, like if that gets, you know, that's a donut, right? Like we'd have to recollateralize the protocol for however much, you know, was stuck in the collateral type. Like you understand our concern, right?
Yeah, definitely understand the concern. And I think if we can take a look at whatever FAQ Pax sent over, you know, we can try to give the same level of assurance, if not more.
All right, sounds like there's some, there'd be useful to have an audit trail as well. So maybe if we can, I sound like a broken record, but if we can bring this to the forum maybe and have a thread dedicated to this where we can get the lawyers to fight it out and reach a consensus and get some documentation in place, that'd be super useful. Help some smart contract developers sleep at night, I believe.
Yeah, and just if I may, last thing, I want the community to think like hypothetical scenario, because this we may end up having to do in the future. Right now, we did, you know, pinning an implementation and everything, you know, joining and exiting the system stops working in case, you know, the community doesn't vote for a planned upgrade. I just want you to imagine, for example, a collateral that already has $50 million worth of value in the system, and that this happens, like, how would you react? So don't think just for this one time. Like, try to come up with good ways, you know, for taking care of a situation like this in the future, where, you know, there's a lot of value and liquidations are turned on and the price is going down and you cannot add collateral to the system because we couldn't do an upgrade. So these are all things that can be fixed, but like we need to think them over.
Yeah, I love that, Mariano, like a disaster recovery scenarios where we can figure out what's the worst thing that could happen or what we do in situation A, B, and C. It's really cool. We're at the top of the hour though, so I'm going to aggressively moderate. Was there anything else that you wanted to leave us with, Mariano, or are we good?
No, let's talk about it next week.
There's always next week. Okay, Vishesh, are you still around? You want to talk about the state of the peg? Come on, buddy. There he is. Right on.
I think I need permissions.
Looks like you're all good.
Sorry, I thought I
Okay.
was on the mic. Yeah, you should be good.
All right, so just to touch on total die supply is at 123 million. Die from ETH is down to 111, and die from BAT about 500,000. WBTC still at around 9.9, and USDC down to 1.1. So let's go into some of those. Just to start off with the state of the peg. So overall, DAI has been trading more or less at $1. It was very, very slightly above for a moment, dipped below. Now it's back above. And then basically what had happened with ETH was ETH was fluctuating quite a bit. When it fluctuated downward, DAI sort of rose up a bit, and then ETH started fluctuating upward again, and then basically there was an increased amount of volume of ETH DAI trading. But since then, basically ETH prices come down a bit again, so we'll have to see what happens with the next next few trades on DAI to determine whether it's going to keep this trend of sort of sitting a bit above peg. My guess is going to be yes, given that if ETH jumps and then dips suddenly, that has a tendency to elevate DAI price. But again, there's been quite a bit of small fluctuations. Again, these are small differences in terms of the grand scheme of things, but they're still fluctuating quite a bit. So we'll have to sort of watch and see, but I would expect DAI to sort of stay with a slight buffer above $1 for a bit. As far as the different collateral types, so BAT DAI supply, again, still sort of stagnant around 500,000. USDC, so basically what we saw was since May, the USDC utilization had come down significantly. It's just been sort of sitting at around 1.2, 1.1 million. So the WBTC DAI supply, we saw basically sudden utilization within a couple days of adding it, and then that had sort of capped out close to the debt ceiling for WBTC. It'll be interesting to know like whether this utilization continues to grow if the cap is increased. My guess would be probably yes. So the limit on utilization right now likely is just a function of new entrants that would want to mint more, just not being able to because of the cap. ETH DAI, so it's been interesting to watch the ETH DAI supply. I think this is the most this is the collateral asset that has been exhibiting a trend. So over time, it's always had the largest debt ceiling, so it has the most room to grow. So what we effectively noticed was, after the decapitation of that growth curve in March, it sort of resumed its growth. We saw a few spikes here and there of individual users performing large mints for short time periods, but the sort of lower bound of that line has just been continuing to grow. What we saw, on May 31st, June 1st was, a few million minted and then suddenly paid back. And then we saw last time we spoke around June 3rd, a large user minting to basically generate outstanding volume on Compound. After effectively a few days, that same user had basically gone back and minted down that, burned down that DAI supply from Maker. So it was effectively a 12 million debt that was generated for the course of 3 or 4 days, and then repaid. Let's say it was a total span of about 6 days, and then repaid. And that is basically the large spike and then dip that you see here in the ETH DAI supply. But that, you know, was apparently for short-term use. Some speculation that that was just to generate some volumes for the comp token distribution. But the base trend is sort of still continued, where you know, a few days prior to that, DAI supply was at around 105 million. It's now at 110. So the smaller individual users have continued to grow that ETH DAI supply, and then there were a few large whales that basically performed short-term mints, which, you know, is something to be aware of, that the way the system is structured, people can easily come in and just mint large volumes for very low cost, and pay them back in short time frames, especially when the stability fees are so low. So that's just a type of usage that you have to expect. This has always been part of the question of keeping the debt ceiling on a leash and not creating, not maintaining an excessively large buffer, because that just creates, you know, a lot of opportunities for this kind of short-term usage of the system, which is a stylistic choice by the community, whether that's a type of usage that you want or not. But the room is there to do it. And, you know, especially right now that that's been paid back, and that the ETH debt ceiling is, you know, at 140 million, that kind of usage can continue to occur. I was going to pull up the order books, but I'll come back to that. So as far as collateralization goes, so for ETH, what we saw was basically an uptick in the 500 plus collateralization category. So there's users that are apparently putting collateral into the system but have not yet minted as much DAI as they reasonably could. So there's a lot of latent potential in the system, which I think is a positive indicator for more mintings in the event that people are more confident in what's going on with the ETH price. Again, sometimes that volatility can cut both ways. So if ETH is particularly volatile, people may slow their rate of leverage activity because they're uncertain of what the ETH price will do. Conversely, you know, volatility tends to lead to liquidations, which can improve the collateralization of the system. Also, volatility is, you know, sometimes a potential indicator that ETH is making a price movement. So again, it can cut both ways, and it's situationally dependent on a lot of other variables. But right now, it seems like there's a lot of potential for minting in the system. There are, on the flip side of things, there are an increased number of vaults that have, you know, lower end collateralization ratios, around 150 and 200%. So that's something to watch. This 200 to 250 category has come up as well. So it's still got this sort of trimodal shape, where you have kind of 3 tranches of users, the sort of middle ground at what has always been kind of the system average, around 300 to 350% collateralization. You have these users with large quantities of collateral but very little minting. And then you have, I would say in the last few months, kind of the rise of this lower end collateralization category, centered around 200%. So you can sort of see reflected in these liquidation walls, basically at ETH prices of 160, 150 and 102 is around where you would expect large groupings of users and large quantities of liquidation if ETH were to hit those prices. So just touch on the DAI USDC direct trading price, not the ETH DAI implied price, is pretty much in line at around 1.002, and what we effectively see is that had been higher in the past and kind of come down very slightly, but still kind of maintaining that small buffer above the $1 peg. It's just, since it's new, it's probably good to touch on WBTC collateralization as well, but WBTC is pretty much entirely, because we know that there's a few singular users, system level users that make use of the WBTC collateral supply, that there's a very tight grouping of that. Collateralization ratio at around 250 to 300%, which is sort of mid to fair. It's slightly less collateralized than the middle of the road for ETH, but it's nothing too particularly risky on a pure asset pricing basis. Obviously, there's other potential risks that come with WBTC, but in terms of asset price, basically your expectation is if you hit 5,500 for BTC price, you'd expect effectively 10 million in liquidations, but very, very, very little at any price before that. So this collateral pool is particularly binary. Okay, so I think that's the meat of what I wanted to share. And then if there's specific questions, I'm happy to double click on anything. Which it does not appear that there are.
Does not look like it. Some interesting things with the WBTC debt ceiling, but I will leave it to the ecosystem to ask those questions. Oh, there we go.
Vishesh, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the stylistic choice of not really going in for short-term use of the protocol. Do you, in a personal capacity, do you think that it's negative behavior? Do you think that it's kind of neutral? Where do you find yourself coming down on this kind of short-term get in, get out behavior?
My response would have to be nice try. It's a technical capability, right? There's a system that does not exact transaction fees that are meaningful. It exacts stability fees, which are by definition a function over time. So it's how the system works. I can't sit here and tell you whether it's good or bad. The community will decide, once they have a tool in their hands, how do they want to wield it? But yeah, I mean, it's a structural design component of the system that it's cheaper to use for short time frames.
Thanks.
All right. I always feel like people are trolling me to see how long it takes me to snap in the awkward silence phase of the call. If you have questions, though, now is the time to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to begin the post-amble and start wrapping things up. Thanks everyone who presented today. Thanks to TUSD for coming on the call, making yourself available for Q&A. Lots of really complicated things that need to be addressed with adapters and how protocol or how collateral gets on board onto the system and what happens when that collateral acts and behaves in ways that we didn't anticipate. So please as Mariano mentioned, join us in the forums to discuss that issue. Also, let's not lose the thread. We need to decentralize quickly and effectively. For that to happen, we need empowered actors. For empowered actors to arise, they need to be compensated, and we don't know how to do that yet. So if you have ideas about how compensation should happen, take a look at MIP 14, I believe, and make your concerns known or ask questions. So the ecosystem has a step 2 to bring that back to the community. Thanks, Charles, for your recap. Thank you, LongForWisdom, and thank you, Vishesh. I think that's going to be it for today. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.